Hi, I'm Donnie and welcome to our YouTube channel. There seems to be these waves of interest in vintage lenses and vintage cameras and film photography. You know, it's funny to me, since I worked in film, I studied film, I used to shoot large format, medium format, 35mm. For 6 years as a professional, I just worked in film. And so much of what I considered, you know, just modern equipment is now considered vintage. Side note, I found it very interesting to see a video of Matthew Poya the other day, the well-known YouTuber, taking pictures on the Instamatic and being so excited that this is the first pictures he's ever taken on film. I just thought, wow, that's amazing. And similarly, it made me feel really old. The experiment that I'm sharing with you today is one, very old camera, and two, very old film. This here is a Yashica LM. It's a twin lens reflex or TLR camera. It's a medium format. It has a 6x6 centimeter format, which means the negative size is, or the chemical sensor is 6x6 centimeters. And twin lens reflex means that it's a bit like a rangefinder camera, in that what you see through the viewfinder is not exactly what you see, but the image that is actually projected onto the film. The viewfinder is directed through this top lens here, and the film gets exposed through one just slightly lower. Alright, so it's a top view camera. You view it from the top, there's a viewing screen, and everything is mirrored that you see. It's right side up, but flipped horizontally. And that just has to do with the prism that they were able to, and the mirror that they were able to use with these cameras. It is fitted with an 80mm lens, which for a 6x6 centimeter format, that would mean a standard lens, or in a 35mm camera or a DSLR full frame, that would be a 50mm lens. So this is the equivalent. Now, specifically the Yashica LM, and there's a bunch of different models, but the Yashica LM, according to the serial numbers that I have on the lens and also on the camera body, this one was produced in 1957, which at the date of recording this in 2021 would make it 64 years old. All right, so this camera is a grandpa, you know, by all accounts, and it is still functional. I got it about 25 years ago when I was still a student. I did some of my student portfolio on it, but in total, I don't know if I've actually used 10 rolls of film on this. Probably, but it hasn't worked hard since I've had it. The camera is not in fantastic nick. It has dropped. I think the owners that had before me probably didn't treat it too well. The lens is not particularly sharp anymore, not that these were anyways. The light meter is not really functional anymore. That's a light meter, by the way. The self timer, yes, it has a mechanical self timer, is not really that functional anymore. And then the last thing is the sync port for flashes works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. All right, so I don't rely on these things if I use it. Just to give you an idea, there's an interesting little, it has a magnifying glass just for you to be able to do fine focusing on the viewing screen. That is the Yashica LM from 1957. This will be the camera that we'll be using. The film that we're using is in fact Ilford XP1. Now, if you are familiar with film from the sort of 80s and 90s, this might seem familiar to you. This was one of the very first black and white films that used color chemistry or C41 chemistry. So you didn't, when you processed this film, you didn't process the normal conventional silver halide chemistry like you would for black and white. The XP1 is a 400 ISO, and it was a very popular film at the time. Now, the interesting thing about this film that I'll be using today is that this particular roll expired November 1994. So let's open it. So this is what, 27 years ago that this expired, and like I said, this means this film is probably about 30 years old. So you open the little box, you get all your sensitometry information on here. There it is, little foil packet. There you go. Let's see, it's like foil. Make sure that there's no light leakage that happens. It says unexposed. So if you have a roll like this that is exposed, standing to a roll like this, you know which one you're supposed to use next and which one you're supposed to take for processing. Process C41, don't go and throw it in a normal black and white bath, it's not going to work. And yeah, so let's load this camera. Apologies for the lighting that is changing all the time, like I'm shooting on my phone today. Loosen the film. So you need to be very careful. If I drop this film and it unrolls, you know, it's exposed, I can't use it again. So how this works is, this is the film, this spool here is what was left from the previous roll, that the previous roll came in. And so what you would do is you take this out. Here we go, this is what the spool that the film is wrapped around. You take it out and you put it in the top. There we go. So this film, as I'm winding it on and I'm taking pictures and exposing, it's going to roll onto the other roll, hence roll film. Same, now I need to put this in here. Alright, so what I do now is, it is inserted. I can pull this over. Alright, put that little lip in there. Make sure it's straight. Now, full disclosure, I have used this before. I had about 5 or 6 rolls of these films, I think 5 rolls. And I have about 10 years ago used it, and it did what I thought it would do. It loses sensitivity. So especially C41, unexposed, it didn't have great archival qualities. Once it's exposed and processed, it would last very long. But color film, C41 processing would have immense color shifts over time. And these are the effects that these days you'd like to imitate on your Instagram filters and on your Lightroom filters and whatever. But at the time that was considered a fault, because I mean it didn't give you good reproduction of color. So I know that this film 8 or 9 years ago, when I last photographed a roll of this, that it lost a lot of its sensitivity. So when I go out today to shoot with it, I will be compensating by about 2 stops. So I will overexpose about 2 stops and treat it as a 100 ASA film or ISO film. And we should be getting reasonable results from that. Just to give you an idea, this is Ilford XP2. This is the current incarnation of XP1. So XP2 is also 400 ISO film. So if you were to go out and buy a 120 Ilford black and white C41 film, this will be the one that you'll be getting. So let's see what happens. So I'm out here at a stud farm, just running the Yashica through its paces. It has no light meter, and so I am using the F16 rule to determine my exposure. Now in the southern hemisphere, in South Africa, that would mean that F16 rule, if you've got a sunny day, your exposure would be around between 11 and 2 in the afternoon. It would be F16 1/25th of a second at 100 ASA. Because we've got some clouds in the sky, even though there's direct sunlight and it's winter, you can bring that down to F16 maybe 80th of a second, like a stop and a half maybe, and then also compensating for the 2 stops that I'm overexposing for the old film. And yeah, that's how you get your guesstimate light reading.
So there you see what it looks like through the viewfinder, seeing the scene. As you can see, it's been flipped horizontally. There the horse is looking to the left, but if you look up, you'll see the horse is looking to the right. Ooh, it's starting to rain. Quick thing, how you wind on, also you're taking a picture, how you wind onto the next frame is you have to cock the shutter. Here we go. And then you have to wind the film on manually using that button. And only then are you ready for the next picture. So it started raining outside, so it was a little bit wet. But as this is a 6x6 format, 120 roll film, there is only 12 frames on each roll of film. So once you have finished your roll of film, you have to wind, open it, and there's the exposed film. Okay, there we go. So you pull that releases the roll of film. There we go. There you go. That's what camera looks like inside. And geez, I've done many of these in my life, just haven't done it in years. So you see the film, the outside backing paper says exposed, and you know your film's exposed. You fold it over, making sure that it stays tight. Give it a lick, and wow, it still tastes like mint. It was very cool. They flavored these little strips. This is a mint one. Anyways, and there you've got your film. It says exposed. You could go and write, your details on there. I would write for the various and at the stud farm. Write your details on there. Or if you're shooting commercial like I did, you'd have like some SKU number or project number or things like that, and then at the lab they would attach that number again on your processed film, so you could keep track of it. But there you go.
I had taken it into the lab, they processed it, and they transferred me the scans. And yeah, we'll be having a look at those and see what it looks like unprocessed. I'm not going to put it through any effects yet, and I'm looking forward to the results. So the first 3 or 4 frames was just a bunch of exposures I made, just a bunch of basically double exposures. Reason being is as I put in the film and I started winding it towards the first frame, there was you can hear from the backing paper how it rolls, and sometimes it sounds like it didn't quite take. So I had to roll it for about 2 or 3 frames just to make sure that the film did in fact take. And in that I did a couple of double exposures because I did, I just cocked the shutter a couple of times. And so that is our first frame. It wasn't just one of those test frames, but also with me wasting a couple of frames, we were only left with about 7 final frames. Right, so here we have our first image of a horse. Now the scans were done absolutely flat, so there's no they use a scan profile that more or less matches the film, but they don't do any editing, so this is about as raw as it gets, and it is equalized. So what they do with scans is there's an automatic equalization, so that if it's way too dark, it'll lighten it slightly, but more or less what you're seeing now is as close to the negative as you reasonably get. And you'll notice that it's not pure black and white, and that's because the scan is RGB, it's not grayscale. So the scan actually picks up a little bit of the tint that you do get in the base film, in the base cellulose of the negative, which is actually quite pleasing. It's sort of a warm, almost a warm black and white. Like you can see, it's actually quite pleasing. The sky behind the horse was fairly overcast with a bit of sunlight straight onto it, and you see a nice tonal range there. It's actually quite impressive, I must say. And also my guesstimate of compensating for about 2 stops and then using the F16 rule seemed to have worked quite well. Right, here we see the frame
Through the viewfinder, as we look at the horse, see that the image is in the picture, it is the right way around again. Here I exposed for the shadows. That's what you do in film. In digital, you'd expose not to blow out the highlights, but in film you have to expose for the shadows to make sure that there is information to draw from the shadows. Whatever is not exposed in the shadows will simply not show up, doesn't matter how much you lighten it. So you have to expose the shadows, and it's easier in film. Your dynamic range allows you to pull back your highlights because the information is buried there and you can pull it back. In digital, it works the other way around. This is what happens if you cock the shutter but you forget to wind on the film, then you get a double exposure. So what you have there is if you look at the top, you'll see there's a bit of clouds, and I'm not 100% sure there's basically just a ghost image laid over the image of the horse, and that is because I did not wind on the film. I ended up double exposing that frame, which was something that the photographers used to use as a special effect, and it has a spooky quality to it. I did like the scene with that horse and his trough. It's just slightly different. Also, the sun did go behind some clouds here, hence the softer light. I was able to bring the exposure back a little bit. I didn't have to overexpose as much. If you to zoom in, the image is not sharp, like I said before, and the lens isn't particularly sharp. You do see detail there, but it will be quite grainy and it'll fall apart. I mean, if I was to really just go and push the curves and push the blacks, that'll just fall into one big black blob in that sort of dark area there. Also important to understand that this is just this is not a specialized scan. This is not a drum scanner. It's not a particularly high resolution scan, so that has something to do with it. It's a normal 8-bit scan. If I was to go and do a 16-bit scan or a 24-bit scan, you would have a lot more detail being pulled from that negative. But at a basic scan like this, I will probably start losing a lot more detail if I was to crunch it, the blacks and especially the shadow areas too much. Well, what is a roll of film if you don't have a landscape with a tree and a road leading off into the distance? Well, as you can see, I shot straight into the sun, yet I was able to still keep a little bit of detail in the sky. Let's see if I use the lumetri controls, color controls, if I can maybe pull some detail back into the sky. Let's see. Without doing any localized editing, just pulling the highlights and the whites a little bit and pulling shadows down just somewhat, you can see that there is a little bit of detail in the sky still. So quite impressive considering that this is 30-year-old film and using a very old camera. But I think you can agree that it does have a complete vibe of its own. It's very dreamy and definitely has that vintage look.
So there you have it. That's a 64-year-old camera with 30-year-old film, still producing results. At this stage, very much artistic, but pleasing nonetheless. I will be sharing some of the pictures on my Instagram. My handle is @DarninelPhoto, and also on my Facebook page. So yeah, please come around, throw us a like there, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and like this video and comment. I would really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one.